Hey, it's John Mcbride with RMUS, bringing you an RMUS TechConnect video that's going to explain a little bit about our new Mavic 2 Enterprise Dual. That's the new thermal and RGB camera put together. And earlier was released the Mavic 2 Enterprise, which talked a little bit, we did an initial video, review video, that talked about the sensors and the capability, and that can be seen right here on this link. If we take a look at that, about the speaker, the lighting system, everything else. But on this video, I wanted to be a little bit more specific on the thermal workflow, how it's going to kind of work into it. And then in this video, we also have a special surprise at the end where we're going to talk to a public service expert who's been out there doing his work and as well running a drone program for his department and working this ship into either his workflow or for the new guys that are considering budgets to bring in this bird, how it's going to work with them in the public service stuff. So that'll be a great key feature on this video today. One of the things we wanted to dispel was right at the get-go, what we had a problem with when announced was the size of the sensor, 160 by 120. And there's been a lot of people that have had opinion on that, whether it was going to be good for using for public service, search and rescue, and as well as getting into inspection. Now, if we understand that the workflow itself can be changed or manipulated to accommodate this sensor, we'll take a look at some of the settings and some of the things on this camera. But when we look at that, this is a ship that will embellish the actual thermal workflow or process. And for a lot of the images that I've seen so far, really great decision-making things. But is it going to give you perfect radiometric temperature data? No. These are like the XT radiometric versus the XT advanced radiometric. There is a temperature sensor on there, there is a spot meter on there, but there are some things that don't allow you to do some of the needs of being an actual inspection tool, which would be changing your emissivity, your spot fixture size, you have your reflective temperature, a number of different things that the advanced radiometric XT and the XT2 can do. So in an inspection standpoint, it doesn't quite hit all of that, but it does give you at least a broad temperature range that you can use for inspection purposes. A lot of this is relative temperature, so we can still make good evaluations between cold spots, hot spots on a roof. And as far as finding somebody, yes, we may have to fly a little bit closer to validate if we see an anomaly that might be a person or not. So those are the kinds of some of the things that we're going to be discussing. Let's take a look at actually the app and see what settings we can do, what we can do in changing stuff to better do our process and workflow, and then we'll take a look at the talking to our public service expert. Within the app, we can see that we have the MSX turned on right now. Other options at the top here is the visible camera. We see Jace right there in our visible camera. And then our IR camera only. So without MSX blending, we have three options basically: MSX, infrared, and RGB or visible. When we talk about the visible camera, since that's probably the most easiest one to really talk about, we have a lot of options here. We can go ahead and set up different video sizes, the type and kinds, how big it's going to be. One thing to consider about this RGB camera is it's basically a Mavic 2 or even in the earlier days an Inspire X3 camera. It's very similar to the same settings. So 12 megapixel, it's still got some really good ability to see very well, and with the spotlight turned on, that's going to work really well too. So we have a lot of settings we can do on the visible side, but that is the visible camera that we can see, and some of the settings we can do. But let's discuss the IR. In the infrared camera, we can see right now I've got a spot meter right in the middle, and if I click anywhere on the screen, I can see where the temperature might change. 65.9 degrees. Let's go to his arm right there, 84.4 degrees. We can see that is actually working pretty well as far as giving us an initial temperature, but remembering that we don't have the ability to change some of the more needed numbers for absolute temperature, but it does help us get us an idea. In the actual menu, if we come to the settings, I can change my color palette, hotspot, rainbow, gray. Not as many color palettes as what we might be used to, but enough to actually to show differences in how they show up on the screen. Let's go ahead and change that back to rainbow. We have isotherm if we want to turn that on or off. Isotherm is a pretty cool setting in which we can isolate a temperature range. We have the gain mode, and for those that are doing, we can see the temperature range as well here, low and high. And if we want a broader, wider view, we can see if we change this to low, what will happen to the camera. And we see it looks almost like pixelated in the background because it's trying to see the incredible amount of temperature throughout the whole range. If we turn it back to high, it's almost like the picture becomes a little bit better, clearer, because the range is a little bit smaller in high gain. Temp alert, we can turn that on or off. So if you turn on the temp alert, we can go ahead and have a number in which the drone will let you know that there is a temperature issue, no matter where you set that. And the auto or FCC trigger. We have two ways we can do this. So the auto shows FFC right here on this button. I can turn that off so it doesn't continually do the movement of, or do the pausing when that happens, or up at the top here where it says FFC, I can hit the trigger. So Jace, go ahead and move your hands up and down, and we can see when we hit the trigger, we have a pause happening right there. Let's watch that one more time. That is a calibration of the sensor, and while we're flying in thermal, that could be problematic if we were basically doing this and trying to use this screen and flying fast. This is good for flying slow, but at any given time that it runs an automatic FFC trigger, we have to remember that it will pause for a second or two while it does that. There's kind of a neat thing around on the bottom here, and we saw that we have internal storage and we have external storage. So basically a micro SD card can be put inside, but for the guys that are just forgot their SD card, it has an amount of internal storage that is kept there. So that's actually a pretty cool setup. As well, if we're looking at other subjects, and we might have to use the RGB camera or the visible camera, I still have the spotlight I can turn on. We can see that turn on pretty bright, on or off. And if I'm looking at something in the IR and MSX, let's look at that. MSX is turned on and uses this outlying image, and if I turn it off, we might see just something kind of blobby here rather than having an outline of what the subject actually is. So if we look around the shop here a little bit and find something like right there, we can see that this temperature kind of mixes in to where if I turn the MSX off to IR, see how that disappears? Very difficult to see in thermal. So the MSX feature, which is a FLIR specific feature in some of their cameras, is blending the RGB camera with the FLIR camera. And that is an option to turn on and off. If we hit the settings on that, I can align them a little bit better. So if they're not quite aligned, I can move them around and align them. And that allows us at different distances away because of the parallax of the two cameras. That allows us to adjust a little bit if we need to line up the two cameras with each other. Probably the last feature I wanted to show on here was right as far as the MSX goes is how much I can actually give it. There's besides it being lined up and straightening it out, there is an amount on the XT2 and the other that gives a definition of how much intensity of the MSX has. Well, this doesn't have quite that amount of intensity. So we want to be very clear that in maybe a very low ambient light, that's how RGB works. So in a very low ambient light condition, that the MSX feature may not work or perform the best. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of comparison videos, and I have some things to show you on some differences between a 336 camera as well as a standard or what's coming out on this Dual. All right, real quick comparison between the different cameras. So basically we did a comparison between a 336 XT 13mm, which I have right here. Put this on an M200, and we filmed the same thing with the Dual, which again is running a 160 by 120 sensor. So I chose this comparison resolution because between the 160 and the 336, those seem to be the closest, and we can see that. But if you get up into the 640 sensor, there's such a huge comparison that I wanted to keep it kind of close so we can see. So obviously if you get a 640, that's going to be a much better resolution and you can see a lot more detail. But with this, we just wanted to keep the field of view kind of the same, as well as show a little bit of the detail that you may miss or might not be able to see, as well as what you can see with this camera. So if we take a look at this video that I have right now, I have my subject in the screen. We see a number of things that are pretty cool here that are missing a little bit of detail, but we can still see our subject very well. And as he moves around in that field, on the background we have a lot more, what do you want to call it, detail on the actual ground. There's a lot more temperature that is picking up, that's radiating off of things, but the subject is showing up just as good. On this video, you know, we can see that we can turn the MSX on and off. And if we look at that real quick, if we pause there, all the details in the ground and everything else that we might not be able to see in a video, as we originally just have the IR setting turned on, it's really helpful for this. The condition here was out, ambient temperature was about 30 degrees, maybe 28 degrees. And our area right there is wide open. We'll see a little bit farther video down here on where this is at, wide open against snow. So we can still see the subject, we can still track the subject, and having that MSX on when we actually turn that on is very helpful to outline a little bit of the differences. So as we move forward right here, I'm going to just kind of talk about what I'm doing when we took this comparison. Is basically what we did was fly a roof right here over the top. We weren't looking for anything specifically for problems, but what we were doing was just seeing what our height was. So I'm starting at a height of about 100 feet and then descending down. And as we descend down, trying to look at some of the details that we can see, whether or not I can see anomalies. You know, again, we don't have a leaky roof here at RMUS, so that's not what I was looking for. But how close did I need to be to pick up any specific details? There you can see the AC up there and the fan. I get a little bit closer, and I'm about 10 to 15 feet away with this camera to see this. And what's projected is the shadow from the sun on the roof, and we can see that pretty good. You can see all the tiles at 10 to 15 feet away. You see the fan moving right there, 10 to 15 feet away. On this video, real quick, again, this was about 100 feet high, and what I was doing here was tracking two subjects. One being moving, as we're both moving here, but then on the left, he'll stop. On the right, I keep moving, and I just wanted to show that 100 feet, it could be difficult to try to pick out an anomaly of a person, obviously here, with the resolution being very low. So with moving, you can see how long it takes you to actually track the person. So I'm just moving the camera gimbal up, we're walking together. And here's when he stops. Now, looking at that, would you know that that was a person standing there in the middle of the parking lot? But as a moving subject, that's much easier to track. Then on this video, what we have is a simple RGB and thermal comparison. So you will be able to play these back. The way that the files are saved is that one is saved in thermal and one is saved in RGB. So in those comparisons, as we can see, there is some differences, some that are very huge and some that are not. So in both cases, we are able to just understand how close we have to be to do stuff. But again, I want to be very clear that as far as an inspection tool, there's some things and liabilities that you have to understand in the thermal side. And as a public service side, there's some things that we need to understand on actually working this into your flight heights and trying to find subjects and do stuff. Still, FLIR is going to be, or thermal imaging, FLIR imaging is still going to be really good for firefighting and stuff like that, to be able to kind of keep track of what's going on around, finding hot spots. Yes, you're going to be able to do all this. So let's go ahead and bring in our special guest, if you will, on this video and get a couple of input and feedback on how he's put this into his workflow. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce to you one of our public service guys that are out there, and as well as an RMUS preferred provider, does training and everything else in Delaware. And as far as doing work with drones, but in 2014. But this is Adam Ringel. Adam Ringel is again one of our preferred providers and a very experienced drone operator. We've been doing this for quite a while, since 2014. You have a number of ships. Why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the ships that you currently run and how this dual is going to work into your workflow?
Well, we currently have a large amount of drones that are operational. We have 5 that are out in the field every day. We have an M600 for heavy duty lifting. We have 2 M210s with XT2s, and we have 2 of these Mavic Enterprise, one being the dual and one being just the Enterprise with the zoom. And then we also have a Phantom 4 Pro that we use for training mostly.
Yeah. So for the most part, putting this ship into your workflow, was there any like major worries about doing that? Or we just kind of, where would this be utilized in your workflow?
So in our workflow, the main benefit of the ship is portability and the sensor size from when we talk about the thermal, which you already addressed previously. The sensor size is a consideration for the use. So this is great because I can get this out in a patrol officer's hands, and I can get them when they're first on scene for things like looking for suspects, looking for victims. In other agencies where they may not have the ability to have a police canine available very quickly, the first officer on scene can launch the drone and search for a suspect or search a small area. And even if it's a wooded area where you wouldn't really be able to deploy an M600 or an M210 with the XC2, this will work fine as long as the officer's been trained in altitude management and understands the actual value of the sensor.
Right.
So where I see this as being a big benefit, especially in our daily workflow, is whether you're a state trooper out on the road and you come across an accident and the vehicle's rolled over and you find one party ejected on the scene. Well, how do you know if you don't have any more people ejected?
Sure.
Well, I can pop my drone up and look real quick, and if it's dark, I can use the thermal. And the best thing about it being a dual RGB and a dual thermal is I can take this out, I can look for that thermal anomaly that you mentioned, and even though with this sensor size at certain altitudes I might not be able to particularly identify what the anomaly is, I'll be able to recognize that there is an anomaly. So once I recognize that there is an anomaly, I can use the RGB sensor, I can switch back to visible,
throw
the spotlight
turn the spotlight on, and we can use that in your workflow process. So even where you're talking about this scenario of a state police looking for a person, that is likely you're going to be flying fairly close to it anyway.
Yes.
You're going to be really close to the area. You're not going to be flying at 400, 500 feet. You're going to be pretty low and trying to search if there is a possible reason to do so if you're not sure about how many people might have been ejected, Yeah,
so, and absolutely. With this aircraft, everything you're considering with this size aircraft is based on portability. They're going to be generally low altitude flights, and they're going to be quick, short, and they're basically designed to be a resource until the rest of your resources get there.
Right.
So you could
definitely first responder side.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
First responder side is critical because you can have a case where you have an officer go to take a missing persons report from an elderly subject that wanders out the back of a property, and the property could be, a little property or it could be a giant 10-acre property. But the officer can initiate the search at night with the FLIR and bouncing back and forth between the RGB and the spotlight to eliminate a large portion of the search area until other resources can get there.
So that's been my experience on doing any search and rescue, is that talking about using thermal cameras and having these fancy, most expensive, you see what we have. But when I've helped with this over the last 10 years of doing search and rescue, and how many times have I actually found the subject out of the many searches I've helped with? 0.
Right.
But what I did do is help clear areas and spaces that would then put the resources where a drone couldn't go.
Right.
Or where we could do a quick look at something without that.
And absolutely, you hit on the quick look feature. So this drone provides the average first responder or patrol officer with the ability to perform that quick look function, now with the added ability of the thermal. And the fact that it's the thermal and the FLIR with the MSX is hugely beneficial when you're looking for just an anomaly with that 160 by 120 sensor.
Yeah.
So
budget-wise, good price?
The price is fantastic. It enables your average department that maybe has a small amount of resources to utilize this drone in search and rescue, in looking for victims, and in foot pursuits through alleyways, through small wooded areas. The bang for the buck that you get with this aircraft, plus the added features that come with the kit, the spotlight, the speaker, all the other things that you can fine-tune for your law enforcement functions. The bang for the buck, it's just astronomical.
Yeah.
The value is unbelievable.
Well, I think we've pretty much touched on not just a review, but also a public service perspective. And that was kind of the idea of this video, is kind of focus a little bit more on workflow and everything else. Just remember that we did do an actual review of the Mavic 2 Enterprise initially with all of the other features, but this is more about that thermal side. So thank you, Adam, for coming and joining us and hanging out and being at RMUS and doing your thing.
Thanks for having me. And oh, well, excuse me.
Yeah, there you go.